On the day I was supposed to become someone's wife, my mother sat beside me in a dress she stitched by hand. She had done my hair like she always did when I was a little girl and scared of the world. And just before the vows, my fiancé's mother turned to her and said loud enough for the guests to hear, "Some people just don't know their place." I stood there in a gown that wasn't mine under chandeliers. I didn't choose surrounded by people who thought they owned the story. And I realized this wasn't my place either. So I walked away. No tears, no apology. What they didn't know was that I came from a woman who survived everything. And 2 weeks later, a man they never expected walked in. My father, a billionaire. And in front of everyone who once erased me, he gave me his name, and I built something bigger than all of theirs combined. The scent of roses hit me before I even stepped into the ballroom. It was the kind of artificial sweetness you get from high-end events engineered overwhelming and meant to impress. I held the bouquet loosely, my palms slightly damp. Every detail around me screamed perfection. From the towering arrangements of white peonies to the chandeliers that probably cost more than my entire student loan debt, this wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance. I stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom of the Langston Hotel in Boston. 200 guests, maybe more, were already seated. I recognized some of the faces from magazine covers and local news interviews. Investors, developers, politicians. People who didn't just walk into rooms like this. People who own them. Ethan's mother, Lorraine Blake, stood near the head table, a glass of champagne in hand, smiling the way someone might when inspecting a showroom kitchen. Cold, polished, and practiced. She looked stunning, of course. Ivory silk diamonds at her wrist, and that signature blowout her stylist probably flew in from New York to perfect. She glanced toward me just once, not quite a nod, more of a scan. Then her eyes moved past me to someone behind. Maybe the photographer, maybe my mother. My mother. Pamela Monroe stood by herself near the back corner of the ballroom in a navy blue dress she had altered herself just 3 nights ago. She looked soft. Strong but small in that crowd. Her hair, always perfect, was swept into an elegant low twist. She had done it herself, of course, she always did. For over 25 years she had made other women look beautiful for weddings she'd never be invited to. I caught the sound of someone whispering just as I started to walk forward. "Is that the hairdresser?" I pretended not to hear. The music shifted. The quartet began something classical and forgettable. Guests turned their heads. The hush was sudden. I smiled mechanically, glanced once more at my mother, and then began the slow walk toward the front. Ethan stood there in a tux that fit too perfectly. Next to him, his father, Gerald Blake, gripped a scotch in one hand and shook hands with a man in a navy pinstripe suit. I was 5 steps in when I heard it. A voice. Feminine. Soft but cutting. "Some people just don't know their place." A laugh followed. Stifled, polite, but very real. My heel hesitated mid-step. I looked left. Lorraine had leaned in to whisper to a woman I didn't recognize. Her smile didn't fade. Her eyes found mine for a fraction of a second, then flicked away. I turned my head quickly to find my mother. She had heard. Her face hadn't moved, but I knew that look. Chin slightly higher, mouth drawn neutral. 1,000 clients had seen that face while she worked through back pain and rude requests. I blinked, held my breath, kept walking. The aisle felt longer than it was. The lights above burned brighter. My bouquet, tightly packed with orchids and roses, suddenly felt like a prop I didn't ask for. When I reached Ethan, he smiled. His fingers reached for mine. "You look incredible, thanks." He leaned in slightly. "You good?" I nodded. I had trained my whole life to nod through things. The officiant began speaking, but I wasn't listening. My eyes found my mother again. She was seated now at the very edge of the second table from the front, next to an empty chair someone had clearly not meant to leave beside her. Lorraine sat at the center of the head table, laughing again. I didn't know at what. I felt my stomach tighten. She doesn't belong here. That's what they meant. That's what they believed. Not just her. Me too. I felt the heat rising in my face. The officiant was still talking. Ethan's hand was warm in mine. I smiled again, not because I wanted to, but because that's what you do in white dresses in rooms like these. My mother's hand lifted to fix a strand of her hair. It was the smallest motion. The kind she used to do when she wanted me to calm down in public. When a teacher talked down to me, when a client shorted her money. It meant hold it in. Not now. I exhaled slowly and squeezed Ethan's hand just a little harder. And I waited for what would come next. The officiant cleared his throat, the microphone catching the low rumble of feedback. Someone chuckled softly in the front row and then stilled when no one joined in. I caught a glance at the program resting on the podium, printed in embossed gold, with words like unity and legacy and curated details of our story that had been heavily edited by Lorraine herself. I had read the draft once, then handed it off without comment. In it, Ethan was described as a visionary and a leader, the third-generation torchbearer of a real estate legacy. I was described as bright, compassionate, and refreshingly grounded. There was no mention of Civic Loop, no mention of my work, no mention of how I built something from the ground up. And definitely no mention of my mother. The officiant introduced Gerald Blake for the welcome toast. He stood slowly holding a glass of something dark and expensive. He smiled with that politician's ease, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. Today, he said, we celebrate more than the union of two remarkable young people. We celebrate tradition, family, a story of perseverance, a journey from humble beginnings to a room like this. Some clapped politely. A few murmured approval. I felt a pulse behind my ear. This is America, Gerald continued, where if you're willing to work hard, to dream big, to rise above where you started, you can end up exactly where you belong. I felt it coming. Like a storm you can smell before it hits. He smiled toward my mother, the gesture so deliberate it made my teeth hurt. Take Pam, he said. She reminds us that you don't have to be born into privilege to raise someone extraordinary. Murmurs of agreement. A few nods. My stomach turned. She taught Clara the value of effort, of simplicity, of staying connected to her roots. And that's something you can't learn at Harvard. Scattered laughter. I looked over at my mother. She hadn't moved. Not a flicker. Gerald sat. The clinking of glasses followed. The quartet picked up again. Then Lorraine rose. I barely heard the first few lines. Something about beauty, about vision, about grace. Her voice was so smooth it was hard to tell whether she was complimenting me or framing me like a photo on a corporate website. Then she paused. I've always admired women who create something out of nothing, she said, especially when no one ever taught them how. It's in their hands, their instincts. The kind of women who don't rely on credentials but on grit. On intuition. She looked directly at my mother. The kind who know their place and remain connected to everyday people. Whose elegance isn't in degrees but in duty. It's admirable. That was when the room went silent. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. That smile. That carefully measured tone. As if she were presenting a portfolio investment. Charming. Contained, weaponized. I felt my nails dig into the bouquet stems. My jaw was tight. I didn't even realize I had stopped breathing until Ethan touched my elbow. Relax, he whispered. That's just how she talks. It's a compliment. No, I thought. It's not. Lorraine sat down and took a sip from her flute. I looked at Ethan. He was watching the officiant again like this was just a bump on a perfect day. A server leaned across the table to pour more champagne. My glass was still full. The officiant thanked the families for their support and mentioned the reading. I didn't hear the words. I kept my eyes on my mother. She had folded her hands neatly in her lap, the same way she used to do when a bride didn't like her updo and demanded a refund. When she delivered groceries to neighbors while still in her apron. When she showed up for my school plays after 10 hours on her feet and clapped like I was on Broadway. She had survived so much. And now she sat still, quiet, listening to people reduce her life into a parable for upper-class amusement. I stood up. Not abruptly. Not with drama, just firmly. The officiant paused. I heard someone whisper, "What's happening?" I took a breath. My voice was steady. Thank you for the reminder. Everyone turned. Of who I never want to become. Ethan looked confused. His brows lifted, hand half raised like he meant to stop me, but didn't know how. I looked at my mother. She stood too. Slowly, gracefully. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just met my eyes and nodded once. Together we turned and walked. The room didn't breathe. The music faltered a few unsure violin notes before the players dropped their bows. The heels of my shoes echoed louder than they should have. As I reached the end of the aisle, I heard Lorraine whisper behind me. She'll regret this. And maybe she thought I would. But I didn't look back. The air outside was crisp, the kind that cuts through even the best makeup. I didn't say a word as we stepped into the waiting car. Neither did my mother. The driver didn't ask questions. We gave him an address in New Haven, and he just nodded. No stares, no judgment. Just the quiet hum of tires on highway asphalt. It was nearly midnight when we pulled into the lot of the old diner. The same flickering neon open sign buzzed above the door. Inside, the place hadn't changed. Same vinyl booths, same chipped countertop, same woman behind the counter with graying hair in a tight bun and a name tag that read Margie. She looked up as we walked in. Her eyes caught mine, widened slightly in recognition, then softened. She gave a small nod, no fuss, no scene. Just like before, we slid into our old booth. Back corner next to the window that used to fog over in winter. My mother settled in like she had never left. I slid the bouquet onto the table. The flowers looked out of place here, surrounded by cracked laminate and sugar packets. Margie came over without a notepad. She didn't ask what we wanted. Pamela will take her usual, she said quietly, then looked at me. Black coffee, right? I nodded. She walked away, and for a moment it was just the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. My mother exhaled slow and deep. We don't have to hide, she said, not anymore. I looked at her. Her hands were folded neatly on the table, her eyes a little glassy from the cold or maybe the lights. We're not hiding, I said. We're just back at the start. She smiled then. Not the kind you give to be polite. The kind that says thank you without needing to say it. I let myself breathe. For the first time all day I really breathed. The tea arrived in the same thick ceramic mug it always came in. My coffee in a chipped white cup. No foam, no art, just heat and bitterness. Perfect. You know, my mother said softly, they probably think you lost your mind. I smiled into my cup. They can think whatever they want. She didn't say anything to that. Just reached into her purse, pulled out a napkin and dabbed at her eyes once. Remember when you used to do your science homework here, she said. That night, with the thunderstorm and the leak over table 7, I laughed. You made me move booths 3 times because you swore that table was cursed. It was cursed, she said, a little laugh in her voice now. 2 bad perms and 1 broken engagement, all on a Thursday. I leaned back, looking around the place. The same faded posters on the wall, the same crooked clock above the register that had never kept time right. You ever think we'd end up back here? I asked. She shook her head. I thought we'd never leave it behind. We sat in silence for a while. The kind that doesn't feel heavy, just familiar. Like we were waiting for a bus together or folding laundry at midnight. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single $5 bill, laid it on the table beside the salt shaker. Just in case we split dessert, she said. I laughed again quietly. A memory flickered through my mind. Me at 10, rain soaked my socks cold inside my shoes. Her drying my hair with napkins from this very booth. Me pretending not to cry because my friends didn't show up to my birthday. She had whispered then, just like now. We're not less Clara, we're just earlier in the story. And here we were again. I looked at her hands. Still strong. Still sure. The same hands that cut hair and folded rent checks and carried grocery bags up 3 flights of stairs. I thought about that ballroom. About the way Lorraine had looked at her. Like she was someone to be tolerated. A footnote in someone else's success story. She's the reason I built anything at all. Not despite her. Because of her. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. Actually, yeah. I reached for her hand and gave it a squeeze. The bell above the diner door jingled, and a young couple walked in laughing about something I didn't catch. They didn't notice us. Just slid into a booth and started reading the menus like this was just another Friday night. My mother sipped her tea. I don't regret anything she said. Not how I raised you. Not what I gave up. I know. We sat there a while longer. No rush, no plans, no one expecting anything from us. Just me and her and the quiet comfort of a place that had always made room for us, even when nowhere else did. Eventually she leaned back and looked out the window. Still raining, she said. I nodded. Let it rain. The windows of the diner fogged slightly as we stepped outside, the cold mist curling around my neckline, rain whispering against the sidewalk in steady rhythm. The street was mostly empty. Just wet pavement, soft light, and the distant hum of a delivery truck turning the corner. Mom didn't ask where we were going next. She didn't need to. I hailed a cab and we rode in silence. Somewhere between New Haven and the city, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. Neither of us spoke until the cab pulled up in front of my office building. Civic Loop was on the 4th floor of a converted factory in Bridgeport. Red brick, exposed beams, and the kind of drafty windows that gave you a headache in January. We had designed it ourselves, Savannah and I. Picked out the desks, secondhand strung the lights, brought in every scrap of energy we could afford at 23. It wasn't beautiful, but it was ours. I let Mom into the lobby and watched her eyes skim the framed articles near the elevator. A local paper piece. A small city planning award. A blurry photo of us in hard hats smiling through dirt and exhaustion. So, this is what you built, she said softly. I nodded. She looked proud, not performative, just quietly proud. The kind of look she used to give me after school plays or report cards, or the time I fixed the washing machine with a bent paperclip. You want me to wait here or head home? I hesitated. There's tea in the break room. You can rest a bit. She smiled and followed me up. The office was quiet, too early for anyone else to be in. The cleaning crew had emptied the trash and the scent of cheap floor cleaners still clung faintly to the air. I turned on the lights. Everything was exactly as we'd left it before the wedding. Savannah's half-unwrapped protein bar. A crooked sticky note that said, "Stop saying sorry, say thank you." I set my bag down and opened my laptop. The startup screen blinked for a moment, then loaded. My inbox filled, subject lines scrolling past too quickly to absorb. I scanned for anything urgent, anything that screamed fire. Instead, I saw a single message flagged in yellow at the top. Subject: Capital Forum Keynote. Updated slide deck. The sender was someone on the Blake Group's marketing team. I stared at it for a moment, confused. Then I opened the attachment. My pulse stuttered as I scrolled through the first few slides. There it was. Page 6. A photo of me. Jeans, clipboard, hair pulled back in a messy knot. I was crouched next to a kid in a red jacket, both of us drawing chalk sketches on the cracked sidewalk of a lot in Hartford. The photo was taken 3 years ago. I didn't even know someone had snapped it. Beneath the image, the title, From Local Roots to Legacy Success, and under that in smaller text, Empowering Communities Through Blake Group Vision. The bullet points made my stomach clench. Grassroots-driven transformation. Neighborhood uplift. Strategic partnerships across underserved zones. There was no mention of Civic Loop. No mention of me. Just a logo stamped in the corner and a slogan they had never earned. I scrolled faster, scanning the rest of the deck. More photos from our projects. Renderings based on our original designs. Charts lifted from our pitch materials. My name was gone, but my fingerprints were everywhere. I didn't realize Savannah had come in until she tossed her phone onto her desk. You're here early. I turned the screen toward her. She leaned over, squinting, then froze. What the hell? She grabbed the mouse and clicked through faster than I had. Are you kidding me? They're using our impact data. Our community feedback slides. Even the map overlay from the Trumbull project. My jaw tightened. I don't know how they got access. Savannah looked at me. Ethan, I didn't answer. She straightened up, her face flushed with fury. This is illegal. We can sue them. At the very least, we go public. I'll call Marty in legal. No way they're getting away with this. I opened the printer tray, pulled a fresh stack of paper, and hit print. You're calm, she said. That's almost scarier. I watched the pages feed out. Slide after slide, dripping with our work stamped with their name. They're trying to erase us from our own story, I said. Savannah crossed her arms. So we write a better ending. I collected the prints, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a black folder. Not yet, I said. She looked at me sideways. You have a plan. I zipped the folder into my bag. Number, I have proof. She didn't press. She knew me too well. She knew what it meant when I stopped talking and started printing. I walked past my desk to the wall of corkboards. Years of planning permits, hand-drawn community layouts, thank you notes from residents, flyers from our earliest pop-ups. All the messiness of impact. Not curated. Not convenient. Just real. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. Then I pinned one more thing to the board. The first page of their deck. Savannah watched me from across the room. You good? I turned to her. Getting there. She nodded once. I'm with you. Whatever you do next. I smiled, then walked back to my desk and opened a blank document. Know your place. That's what they said at my wedding. That's what they wrote in every line of that slide deck. But I know better now. Because I helped build this place, and I'm not giving it away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the pitch deck or the headlines or even the sound of rain still drumming softly against my window. I couldn't sleep because something was pressing at the edge of my chest, just beneath the anger, something I couldn't name. I got up around midnight and wandered into the living room. The apartment was quiet. My mother had gone to bed hours ago, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender hand cream and a mug with a lipstick ring on the counter. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sat on the floor beside my bookshelf, and stared at the rows of old storage boxes stacked in the corner. One box was different, older, covered in dust and sealed with worn masking tape. I had never noticed it before. It wasn't mine. I pulled it down and set it on the rug. My fingers hovered for a moment before I peeled back the tape. Inside was a collection of loose papers, old envelopes, a few yellowed photographs, and a wooden hairbrush with a broken handle. The first photo caught my breath. My mother was younger, maybe 20. She was laughing, sunlight catching her cheek, hair wild and long, nothing like the tight buns and polished waves she wore now. Her arm was looped around a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, tan, wearing a faded button-down and jeans. His hand was resting gently on her back. They looked happy. I pulled out another photo. This one of the two of them sitting on the hood of a beat-up car parked in front of a lake I didn't recognize. He had his head leaned against hers. There was a letter folded in thirds addressed to Pamela Green in faded ink. No return address. I hesitated, then opened it. Pam, I'm sorry I left like that. I should have fought harder. You deserved more than silence. My father said things I'll never forgive him for. I should have stayed anyway. I think about you every damn day. I think about what we could have had if I'd had more courage and less fear. If you ever want to find me, I'll be in Chicago. Still at the firm. Same name, same number. Robert. The signature was scrawled in blue pen. I read it again. Robert. No last name, but my heart already knew. I dug deeper into the box. Near the bottom, tucked beneath a birth announcement and a receipt from a Greyhound ticket, I found my own birth certificate. It was an old copy. My full name typed in clean black letters. Under father's name, there was only a single line of ink that had been scribbled out with a thick black marker. I held it up to the light, trying to make out the letters beneath, but it was no use. The room felt smaller suddenly. The weight of unspoken things filled every corner. I didn't knock when I walked down the hall and pushed open the door to the guest room. Mom sat up immediately. Clara, what's wrong? I didn't say anything at first. I walked in and set the box down at the foot of her bed. She looked at it, then at me. Where did you find that? Behind the bookshelf. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of breaking something. You weren't supposed to see that. Why not? Because it's from a time I tried to leave behind. I sat on the edge of the bed. She reached for one of the photos, held it gently between her fingers. Is that my father? She didn't answer right away. Just trace the edge of the image with her thumb. His name is Robert Ellis, she said, finally. We met when I was 20. I was a hair assistant at a salon in Naperville. He was clerking for a judge downtown. I thought he was just another law student. But he wasn't. His family owned half the buildings in the Loop. Old money. Very old. Did he leave you? He didn't want to. His father gave him an ultimatum. If he stayed with me, he'd be cut off. No trust, no firm, no name. And he was scared. I don't blame him for being scared. But I hated him for choosing that fear over us. Did he know you were pregnant? Yes. I told him. Did he ever try to come back? He wrote. Once or twice. I never answered. Why not? Because I was trying to survive. I was 21 working 60 hours a week trying to buy diapers and pay rent and not lose my mind. I couldn't afford to miss someone who didn't stay. I looked down at the photo again. At the man who looked like someone I had imagined when I was little and asked too many questions about why my friends had dads who picked them up from school. Does he know about me now? She nodded slowly. I think so. I never confirmed anything, but I think he always suspected. You said he was in Chicago, last I heard. I don't know where exactly. I haven't spoken to him in almost 30 years. I stood and walked to the window. The rain had started again, softer now. Just enough to blur the streetlights below. Do you want me to find him? I don't want you to do anything for me, she said gently. But I think you might want to do it for yourself. I turned to face her. I just want to know if he's the kind of man who regrets what he left behind. She smiled sadly. That's a question only he can answer. I left the room a few minutes later, the photos still in my hand and a name I hadn't spoken out loud sitting quietly at the back of my throat. Robert Ellis. I didn't know what I was going to do with that name yet. But I knew it wouldn't stay in the box much longer. The receptionist at Ellis Ventures had the kind of face that didn't flinch, not even when I gave her my full name. She just nodded, typed something quietly into her computer, and handed me a clipboard. Mr. Ellis doesn't meet with anyone without legal channels, she said. But his counsel can receive the documents. That's fine, I said. I'm not here for a reunion. The clipboard was warm from a recent touch. I filled out the form, double-checked the spelling, then slid a sealed envelope across the marble counter. Inside was a DNA sample notarized, swabbed, and processed the morning before at a private lab I trusted. The receptionist flipped it once, noted the initials, and tucked it under her arm, like it was no more interesting than a delivery. Would you like confirmation of receipt number? But I want a reply. Understood. I turned to leave. The lobby was spotless, sun pouring in through tall glass panes that looked out over Michigan Avenue. Everything about the building was quiet money. Old, heavy, and permanent. Back in the hotel room that night, I couldn't stop checking my phone. I told myself I wasn't waiting. I told myself this was just about curiosity. Closure. Data. But every time the screen lit up, my breath paused. It took 3 days. The message came from an unknown number. A simple text. Miss Monroe, your request has been reviewed. Mr. Ellis would like to invite you to meet. His legal representative is available Thursday at 10 a.m. Conference room 5B. No mention of paternity. No reaction. Just a formal invitation in 21 words. Savannah offered to fly out with me. I told her no. I didn't tell my mom I was going either. She would have told me I didn't need to do this. That I already had enough people in my life who mattered. She would have been right. And I still would have gone. The building looked even taller the second time I walked through its revolving door. A different receptionist buzzed me through. Conference room. 5B was down a wide corridor tucked between a law library and a boardroom with windows that looked like they belonged in a courthouse. Inside, a woman stood when I entered. Early 40s, slim, wearing a charcoal pantsuit and thick glasses. Miss Monroe. I'm Harper Liu. Counsel to Mr. Ellis. We shook hands. Hers was cool and dry. Please have a seat. The room was spare, clinical. A table, 2 chairs, 1 water pitcher, no family photos, no warmth. Mr. Ellis is not present today, she said, as she sat. but I have full authorization to speak on his behalf. I didn't respond. First, I'll confirm receipt of your sample. It was matched to Mr. Ellis's prior DNA on file from a routine medical matter. The results were conclusive. Conclusive. I swallowed once. He's my father. Yes. And he knew. Not officially, but he suspected. He's followed your work for several years. What do you mean followed your company? Your public talks. The award in Raleigh. The urban lot redesign in Camden. He's watched from a distance. I leaned back in the chair. He never reached out. It wasn't his place, Harper said. That was his choice. Out of respect for your mother, I didn't answer right away. My fingers tightened around the glass of water in front of me. He's seen the video. Yes. Of the wedding, yes. And he's aware of how the Blake family treated both you and your mother. I looked out the window. A pigeon landed awkwardly on the ledge before flapping away again. Why am I here? Because Mr. Ellis regrets not being in your life. And he doesn't want to make the same mistake twice. I scoffed lightly. This isn't a second chance, no, Harper said. It's a first acknowledgement. And an offer. She slid a folder across the table. Black leather. No logos. Just initials in silver. Inside a notarized letter. A new will. It states that you are Mr. Ellis's legal daughter. You are now listed as an heir with 40% of his private trust allocated to you. I blinked. Excuse me, you don't have to accept anything today. But the paperwork is already signed. It's irrevocable. I stared at the page, then slowly closed the folder. Does he want something in return? Just a meeting. I stood gathering my coat slowly. Tell him I'm not ready. Harper didn't argue. Of course, but if you change your mind, he'll be waiting. I left the room without looking back. The hallway felt longer this time, the air colder. When I stepped outside, the sun had shifted, casting the buildings in sharp early afternoon light. I crossed the street without thinking, turned a corner, and kept walking. I didn't stop until I reached the lakefront. Then I sat on a bench overlooking the water, folder still clutched in my hand, and for the first time in days I let myself feel something I couldn't name. It wasn't anger, or grief, or even relief. It was the beginning of a sentence I hadn't known I needed to say. By the time I got back to the hotel, my phone had 15 missed calls and over 40 unread messages. I didn't check any of them. I knew exactly what they were. I dropped the folder from Harper onto the desk, changed into an old sweatshirt, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor. It felt like the moment after a storm when everything was still wet and heavy, but the wind had stopped. You couldn't tell if it was over or just taking a breath. Savannah was the one who called, not texted. She never called unless it was urgent. You've seen it, right? Seen what? The article. I unlocked my phone and opened the first link she sent. Blake family wedding drama hints at mental health crisis. I skimmed the subhead. Something about emotional instability. About generational pressure. About how some women, even bright ones, just weren't cut out for life in the spotlight. There was a quote. Unnamed family source. She was under a lot of stress. Ethan tried to be patient, but Clara didn't come from our world. I sat very still. Savannah's voice buzzed in my ear. They're spinning it like you snapped. Like you couldn't handle the pressure of marrying into money. They're trying to paint you as the unstable charity case who lost her mind over a comment. Of course they are. They also scrubbed the Civic Loop mention from their site. You're gone. Like you were never part of anything. I exhaled slowly. Let them talk. Clara, I'm serious. Let them talk. There was a pause. Then softer. What happened in Chicago, I'll tell you later. Promise, promise. After we hung up, I scrolled through the other messages. Texts from acquaintances. A few distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. A news anchor I once did a zoning panel with who wanted a comment. And then there was Ethan. The first text was just, can we talk? Then I didn't know they were going to say those things. Then I'm sorry. Please don't think I wanted it this way. Then you're not alone. I still care. I always did. I stared at the screen for a long time before I typed back. You were standing there when my mother was humiliated. You were silent. Please continue being that way. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned off the notifications and dropped the phone onto the carpet. The silence felt better. Mom knocked on the door a few minutes later, holding a small white envelope. This came for you. No return address, just my name in cursive. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note. Folded once. Simple handwriting. Pamela, I don't want to complicate things. I just need to say I'm sorry for leaving. For being weak. I never stopped wondering about her. I've watched from a distance. I know you don't owe me anything. But if she asks, tell her the door was never locked. I just couldn't open it. Robert, I read it twice. Then again. Mom stood across the room, arms crossed. Not cold. Just guarded. You didn't tell me you reached out to him. I didn't. Not directly. She nodded once. Do you want me to write him back? No. Are you angry? I don't think I am. I'm just tired. She sat beside me on the bed. He was scared, she said. He let fear decide for him. That's something I never respected, but I understand it more now. I leaned my head against her shoulder. I met his lawyer, she tensed. And he confirmed it. DNA, legal acknowledgement. Updated will. Mom didn't speak for a long time. He offered me 40% of his trust. I felt her exhale. It doesn't change who I am, I said. Or what you did. She nodded. I just want you to be clear about what he didn't give you. I am. And about what you might still want from him. That part I wasn't so sure about. Later that night, I stood at the kitchen counter holding the envelope, turning it over in my hands. Not because I needed more from it, but because it was something I never thought I would have. Not money, not legacy. An apology, late but real. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which man disappointed me more. The one who ran from my mother or the one who stood beside me and said nothing. Maybe the difference didn't matter. Maybe silence cuts the same no matter who holds the knife. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, slipped under the office door in a thick white envelope that felt more like a challenge than a courtesy. I recognized the crest embossed on the flap before I even opened it. Blake Group. Still pretending we were on good terms. Inside the wording was perfect. Polished. Phrases like community sustainability legacy. They invited me to the launch of the Legacy Green Initiative, a new urban development project celebrating diverse voices and groundbreaking partnerships. No mention of Civic Loop, no acknowledgement of our work. Just a request for my presence at the Boston Conservatory Ballroom Thursday at 7. I left the envelope on my desk for a full day before touching it again. Savannah didn't even try to be neutral when she saw it. They're baiting you, she said. I know. They want a photo op. You smiling pretending the past didn't happen. A PR wipe. I nodded, eyes still on the envelope. You're not going, are you? I picked it up slowly, slid the invitation back inside and closed it. I think I have to. Savannah raised an eyebrow. You're braver than me. Or more spiteful. I'm not sure which. Maybe both. The night of the event, I stood in front of my mirror for 15 minutes adjusting a simple navy suit that hugged my frame without calling attention to itself. No makeup beyond tinted lip balm. No jewelry, no mask. I wanted to look like someone who no longer had anything to prove. Harper Liu met me at the venue. She was dressed in tailored gray, crisp and silent with a stack of legal folders tucked under her arm like she was walking into court. The Blake Group had spared no expense. The ballroom was lined with LED-lit display boards showing renderings of parks, green rooftops, food, co-ops. Words like impact and resilience floated across the screens in looping slides. I scanned the images for signs of our designs and found them on the third rotation. Our benches. Our tree layout. A snapshot of a mural I knew down to the last brushstroke. And then I saw me crouched next to a boy in Hartford, both of us laughing, drawing chalk outlines of a future that had nothing to do with Blake money. I looked up and saw Lorraine Blake taking the stage. She spoke with the same smooth cadence she used at the wedding. Voice dripping with calculated warmth. At Blake Group, we don't just build buildings, we build legacies. Our Legacy Green initiative reflects our commitment to restoring, uplifting, and reimagining urban spaces across the Northeast. We believe in elevating local voices, supporting grassroots change, and honoring the fabric of the communities we serve. I looked at Harper. She gave me a slight nod. Lorraine continued. This project brings together the best of architecture, innovation, and compassion. It's a partnership of purpose. On the screen behind her, the photo of me with the boy appeared again, framed in a soft white border with the caption, "Community in Action." The silence that followed her last line was brief, broken by polite applause. She stepped back from the podium, gesturing to the renderings behind her. I stepped forward. "Excuse me." Every head in the front row turned. Someone from the events team moved as if to intercept me, then hesitated. Lorraine blinked when she saw me. She recovered quickly, her smile stretching tighter. "Clara. What a lovely surprise." I didn't reply. I walked to the center of the aisle, folder in hand. No microphone, no invitation to speak. But no one stopped me. The Blake Group has used my image, my work, and the story of my community without consent. They have repackaged the labor of Civic Loop as their own. These renderings, these slides, these partnerships, many of them began without their funding, without their leadership, and without their names attached. I opened the folder and held up the printed deck. A journalist in the second row lifted his camera. This was taken from our original proposal for the Trumbull Corridor. Slide 5. Identical, line for line. I flipped to the next page. This image of a child and me in Hartford was taken 3 years ago during a community paint day. It was not a press event. We were not on salary. We were on sidewalks. Harper stepped forward and handed copies of the folder to 2 reporters seated near the front. I am not here to embarrass anyone. I am here to remind you that legacy cannot be borrowed. It has to be earned. The silence was thicker this time. Lorraine's face didn't move, but I saw the twitch in her fingers as she adjusted the brooch on her dress. A woman from the Boston Globe raised her hand. "Mrs. Blake, did your team seek permission from Miss Monroe or Civic Loop for the use of these materials?" Lorraine stepped forward, composed. "We believed we were celebrating shared success. If there was an oversight, we're happy to discuss it privately." I stepped down from the platform. "You already had the chance to do that." I didn't wait for her response. As I reached the back of the room, I heard another question. "Clara, do you plan to file formal action?" I kept walking. Outside, the night was cool and damp. Harper followed me out a few moments later. "You all right?" I nodded. "It wasn't about revenge," I said. She looked at me. It was about record." We stood for a minute at the curb as a black sedan pulled around the corner. "And sometimes," I said, "the record needs to speak for itself." I climbed into the car without looking back. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. Harper's voice was steady as always, but there was something softer behind her usual professionalism. "Mr. Ellis would like to meet in person," she said. "No lawyers. No documents. Just the 2 of you. He'll be at Marquette Park in Chicago on Thursday at noon. He said you'd understand why." I listened to it twice, phone pressed against my chest the second time. Then I deleted the message, not because I didn't want it, but because I had already memorized every word. 2 days later, I flew out alone. I didn't tell my mother. I knew if I saw her eyes before I left, I might change my mind. Some moments belong to silence. Chicago in early November was quieter than I remembered. Cold wind brushed the lake-stripped trees of their last copper leaves and left the air raw against my face. Marquette Park was almost empty when I arrived, just a few joggers and a man feeding birds in a gray coat. I walked slowly down the gravel path, the crunch under my boots grounding me more than anything else had in weeks. He was already there. Robert Ellis sat on a weathered bench near the pond. A wool coat draped over his shoulders, leather gloves folded neatly on his lap. In front of him, resting on the bench, was a thin wooden frame. I recognized her before I reached them. The photo was black and white. My mother, 21, holding a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her face was tired but full. Young and strong and already carrying everything. He stood as I approached. For a man in his 60s, he moved with a kind of caution, like every gesture had to be earned. "Clara," he said. I stopped 3 feet away. "That's her." "Yes. You kept that, all this time." We stood in silence. I didn't know where to sit, or if I should. But he gently gestured to the bench, and I lowered myself beside him without meeting his eyes. "She never showed me that photo. I didn't think she would." "You took it." "The nurse did. I was there for a few hours before I left the hospital. She let me hold you. Just once." I looked straight ahead. Across the water, 2 kids were tossing breadcrumbs at ducks that ignored them. "So why now?" "Because I saw your name 3 years ago in a press release about community-led planning. And I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 30 years. Guilt, pride, that made me blink. I read everything I could about Civic Loop. Watched your TEDx talk. Saw the Camden interviews. I never doubted who you were. You didn't try to contact me. I wanted to. Every year on your birthday. But I had no right. And now I have regret. But I also have something else. A truth I should have given you long ago." He reached down and lifted a black envelope from his bag. He handed it to me with both hands. Inside was a single document. Notarized. Signed. Addendum to Living Trust. Clara Monroe Ellis beneficiary. 40%. Irrevocable. I stared at the numbers. "I don't want your money." "It's not money. It's recognition. A stake in what should have been yours from the start." "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing." I looked at him. He wasn't lying. He wasn't begging. He was just there. "She thinks you're a coward." "She's right. You left her when she needed you." "I know." I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "This doesn't fix anything. I'm not trying to fix anything. I just wanted you to have it." I nodded. "Once." Slowly. We sat there a while longer, saying nothing. A breeze lifted fallen leaves around our feet. He adjusted the frame on the bench like it might blow away. I pointed to the photo. "Do you have any more like that? Just one?" "It's at home. I can send it to you." She was smiling in that picture. She always smiled like that when she was scared. "So do I." He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "I'm not asking you to call me Dad." "Good. I'm not sure I ever will." "Fair." I stood then, tucking the envelope under my arm. "Thank you for this. I don't know what I'll do with it." "Whatever you want. It's yours now." He didn't try to hug me. He didn't ask if he could call. He just sat there as I walked away, still holding the frame, still watching the water. I didn't look back, but I didn't delete the photo from my mind either. It stayed with me. Like a door that was never locked. Only closed. The wind in Boston had that sharpness that cuts through wool coats and confidence alike. I pulled my scarf tighter as I walked up the marble steps of the Beacon Forum Convention Center, the glass doors reflecting a sky still deciding whether it wanted to rain. Inside, the hum of a few hundred urban planners, architects, policy wonks, and media mingled under chandeliers that reminded me of old hotel lobbies and late-night city budget hearings. The Massachusetts Urban Development Conference wasn't usually headline-worthy. But this year, they had elevated the roster, tightened security, and brought in investors. Legacy Green's PR machine had made sure the Blake Group would be featured prominently despite their recent stumbles. I was scheduled to speak that morning representing Civic Loop in a keynote about grassroots-led zoning. Savannah adjusted the mic on my collar as I waited backstage. "You sure about the closing line?" "Yes." "Good. It's bold. It's honest." When my name was called, the lights above the stage washed everything in gold. I walked out into a room of pressed suits and careful applause. I didn't smile, I just began. Urban planning is never neutral. Every blueprint draws a line through someone's life. That line caught their attention. I could feel the air shift. I spoke about corner lots and playground deserts. About public benches designed without shade. About how zoning laws are written in boardrooms but lived in by mothers walking to bus stops with their children at 6 in the morning. Then I said this. I was almost part of a legacy family. They build towers and name streets and speak in phrases like elevation and vision. But when my mother walked into their ballroom in a hand-sewn dress, they said she didn't belong. And when I left, they called me unstable. A few murmurs stirred, a rustle of notebooks and shifting posture. That's the thing about planning, I continued. It's easy to draw over what's already there if you don't respect the hands that built it. The applause at the end was loud. Polite, but not empty. I stepped off the stage and made my way toward the rear of the conference hall where the coffee line had already reformed and press badges hovered like bees. Lorraine found me near the side doors. She looked flawless, of course. Tailored pale blue suit. Gold pin. Her expression was exactly the right mix of warmth and concern. "Clara," she said, lightly touching my elbow. That was quite the speech. I turned. "Lorraine." She tilted her head, a familiar gesture of rehearsed grace. We all say things in the heat of the moment. Words we wish we could take back. I didn't move. Words are one thing, silence is another. She hesitated. A fraction of a second. Enough to register. "You know," she went on, "we both want to do good. You with your maps, me with my investments. Maybe we just started on the wrong foot." "You mean the foot that kicked my mother out of a story she helped write?" Lorraine stiffened. "I'm not here to fight, Clara. I believe you. Then maybe we can find a way to repair this. For the public. For appearances." There it was. The real reason. I gave her a small smile, not warm, not cruel. Just tired. There are things you can't erase. I'm not here to help you repaint history. I'm here because I finished my part. Her eyes narrowed just a breath. And then she composed herself again. "As you wish." She turned, heels clicking against the polished floor, vanishing into a group of donors from Cambridge. I stepped away, needing air but not quite ready to leave. I walked toward the rear hallway that led to the garden atrium where vendors had set up their sustainability booths. That's when I saw him. Ethan. He wasn't in a suit this time. Just slacks and a wrinkled button-down, a lanyard half stuffed into his pocket. His hair was messier than I remembered. His eyes searched the crowd until they landed on me. He moved forward. I stopped walking. 2 security staff were already approaching, checking badges. Ethan didn't have one. "Clara," he called, low enough not to cause a scene but loud enough that I felt it in my spine. The guards asked him something. He pointed at me. "Do you know him, ma'am?" I met Ethan's eyes. "Number." He faltered. The guards gestured for him to step aside. He didn't fight them, just stood there watching as I turned away. I walked slowly back toward the main entrance, the last echoes of my speech still lingering in the halls. Outside, the wind had picked up again. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped down onto the sidewalk, each footfall quiet, steady, and my own. Thursday morning settled over Boston like a held breath. At the Civic Loop office, the coffee machine sputtered the way it always did, and Savannah was already 2 folders deep in the latest zoning proposal when I stepped in. She gave me a look over her glasses, half greeting, half wordless check-in. I nodded. I was fine. Mostly. I spent the next few hours answering emails, drafting slides for a neighborhood presentation, and reading through updated flood zone ordinances for a property we were trying to reclaim for a community garden. It was enough noise to keep my mind focused, and that was all I needed. Until just after 1 p.m. The door opened with the kind of careful pressure that said the person behind it knew they weren't exactly welcome. I looked up. Ethan. He closed the door gently behind him and stood there, hands shoved in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. Savannah from the back corner tensed in her seat. She didn't say a word, but I could feel the way her body stilled. She was protective like that. She always had been. I raised my hand slightly, signaling it was okay, or at least that I could handle it. Ethan's eyes flicked between us. "I didn't call because I thought you'd say no," he said. "You'd have been right." He swallowed, nodded once. "Can we talk? We're already talking." Alone, I shook my head. "No secrets here. If you've got something to say, say it." He hesitated, then took a slow step forward. "I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't move. I'm sorry for how I stood there. For saying nothing, for letting it happen. I thought I could keep the peace, keep both sides from breaking apart, and instead I just watched you leave. I let out a quiet breath. You didn't watch, you stood still, and that silence was a choice. I know. He paused. It haunts me. That's not my burden to carry anymore. I wanted to reach out. After. But everything was falling apart. The PR crisis. My mom doubling down, the board whispering. I didn't know where to start, so you started nowhere, and hoped I'd forget. No, he said quickly. I never hoped that. I knew you wouldn't. Then why now? Because I can't move on without saying it. Because I can't look at myself if I don't try to say this right. I looked at him, then really looked. Not as the man I almost married. Not as the boy who used to bring me lemon tea when I pulled all-nighters. But as someone who finally realized the cost of inaction. You're not a bad person, Ethan. But you made a coward's choice. He flinched. And I made mine, I added. I chose my mother. I chose myself. He nodded slowly. I loved you. Maybe you did, but love without protection isn't love I can use. I walked toward the front of the room, past the table where we held open forums, past the wall lined with feedback postcards from neighborhoods most developers wouldn't set foot in. You let your family rewrite the story. You stood back while they erased me from the company deck, from the guest list, from the name tags. And when your mother called mine less than, you said nothing. He looked down. I can't undo it. I can't rewrite what I didn't say. You can't. There was a pause, heavier than the air before rain. But you're doing okay, he said, glancing around. I'm doing more than okay. I'm building what your world tried to bury, and Civic Loop is mine. With no strings. No apologies. He looked like he might cry, but didn't. That would have been too easy. Do you hate me, number, but I don't miss you either. He exhaled through his nose. That landed. I'm proud of you, he said. You don't get to be. He nodded again. No protest. Just that same hollow acceptance. Then he turned toward the door. Ethan. He stopped. Thank you. He blinked. For what? For showing me exactly where I stand, and where I never want to stand again. He didn't answer. Just left the door clicking shut behind him with the softest sound I'd heard all day. Savannah walked out from the back room, arms folded. Want me to burn some sage or something? I smiled. Just close the door tight. She did. I sat back down at my desk, the wind rattling softly against the window behind me. My cursor blinked where I'd left off in the proposal draft. I picked up where I'd stopped, one sentence at a time. No longer waiting for permission to continue. The stage lights were softer than I expected, warm, almost golden, the way morning light filters through a diner window when the world is still waking up. I stood behind the podium in a fitted navy dress, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the microphone. The room was packed not with strangers, but with people who had shown up for something bigger than a launch. They came for legacy, yes. But this time it was ours. The New Haven Civic Center buzzed with quiet conversations, heels on tile, muffled coughs, and the rustle of programs being unfolded. On each seat a single card printed in charcoal ink: Pamela Foundation, for the future of urban voices. In the center of the card was a photo. Not of me, not of Robert. But of my mother, 21 years old, holding a baby on her hip outside a hair salon that no longer exists. I looked down at the front row. My mother was sitting next to Robert. She wore her favorite burgundy wrap dress, a soft gold pin on her collar, and a look on her face that said she still couldn't quite believe this was real. Robert, for once, didn't wear a tie. Just a charcoal suit and a matching expression of quiet reverence. He hadn't tried to take the spotlight. He had simply asked if he could be there. As a guest. As a father. I cleared my throat. Thank you all for coming. When we first imagined the Pamela Foundation, we didn't imagine a gala or a headline. We imagined a door. The room quieted. We imagined a door that didn't need a key. A space for girls who are told they don't belong in the rooms where cities are shaped. For the daughters of bus drivers, of night shift waitresses, of women who never made it past the blueprints. My voice was steady. My heart pounded. I grew up in the back of a 24-hour diner. in a salon where dryers rattled and women laughed louder than the radio. I wasn't raised with investors or design awards. But I was raised by someone who never once made me question my worth. I looked at my mother. She didn't blink. Just smiled, eyes glassy proud. We're awarding our first 20 scholarships this fall. Each one covers tuition, housing, and a paid summer internship with one of our community planning partners. These aren't handouts, these are acknowledgments. Applause broke out, but I wasn't finished. I've been asked how it feels to be part of a legacy. To stand here as someone who now has a title, a stake, a name. I paused. I didn't need anyone to give me power, I just needed someone to stop telling me I had none. A murmur of approval rippled across the room. For a long time, I thought I had to wait for permission to speak. For someone to say I belonged, but the truth is you don't wait for permission. You claim your place, you make it. I looked toward the side of the room. Harper was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, lips curved ever so slightly. Savannah sat beside the sound tech, probably double-checking the slides and already texting the press team. And then I looked back at Robert. He stood. It was unplanned. But he walked slowly to the second mic beside me, adjusted it just slightly, and looked at the crowd. I would like to say something. The room hushed. My name is Robert Ellis. I spent 30 years avoiding the truth of who I am. I let fear convince me to step aside from the most important chapter of my life. But I am here now. Not to erase the past, not to rewrite it, but to stand with it. He looked at me. This is my daughter. She is the future of what my name could never buy. And today, I don't give her my legacy. I recognize hers. There were no cheers. Just silence. The kind that carries weight. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward my mother. She stood. I reached for her hand. She took it. We didn't need to speak. That night, after the lights dimmed and the guests began to filter out into the cool evening air, I stood alone near the back of the room. One of the scholarship recipients, a 17-year-old girl from Bridgeport, came up to me wide-eyed and unsure. She said she wasn't sure if she deserved the opportunity. She asked how I knew when it was okay to claim space. I told her I didn't know, but I stood anyway. If someone once told you to know your place, I hope you remember this. You're the only one who gets to define it, not the person who doubted you, not the room that excluded you. You. If you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever walked away from a table where no one saved you a seat, I want to hear your story. Tell me what happened. Tell me what you claimed. I read every message. Every line. And I'll keep telling the ones that matter. Starting with yours.